It seemed at the time impossible.
Has the most famous ship in the history of the world been discovered at last?
The Gilgamesh epic paralleled exactly the story of Noah in the Bible.
There is plenty of ancient historical evidence spanning nearly 2,000 years that the Ark is on Mount Ararat.
The location of the mystical Mount Sinai itself is the subject of relentless argument.
The biblical story of the burning bush is completely true and totally provable.
It must have seemed to Moses that God was asking him to do the impossible.
In the book of Matthew, we're told that the graves were opened and the bodies of many dead saints were raised to life.
During the night, all of Sennacherib's army had been struck down by some kind of plague.
Mary Magdalene was a woman of independent means and spirit.
For nearly 2,000 years, she's inspired millions of people, especially women.
The Grail is believed by many to be the cup containing the wine that Christ associated with his blood at the Last Supper. According to the legend, only Sir Galahad was able to reach it, dying in a moment of transcendental glory. The sound of pottery shattering caught his attention. The curiosity of the world was ignited.
The Dead Sea Scrolls date back almost 2,000 years.
Along with the many papyrus and leather scrolls was a scroll made of copper. As Herod's men attempted to open the tomb, a blast of flame filled the chamber and drove them back.
God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place.
And the stars of heaven fell unto earth.
Fires are burning all over the city. Several plane crashes with countless calls keep coming in. Complete chaos is the only way I can describe the situation.
For the great day of his wrath is come.
It turns out that Bible prophecy has an unparalleled record of accuracy.
The focus of the conflict lies in the destiny of Jerusalem.
This will be the last great battle, and one in which God himself will eventually take part. You'll be amazed at what has been discovered. Mary Magdalene. Is it possible that solving the mystery of who this woman really was could rewrite biblical history? Or was Jesus simply trying to send a message to the world through this woman? Was she merely a follower in the company of Jesus? Or was she one of Christ's beloved disciples? In part 2 of the program, we'll examine another mystery that has supposedly been solved, but apparently to no one's satisfaction.
Is it possible that in 1917, while World War I still raged, 2 little girls and 1 small boy actually saw and heard the Virgin Mary in a meadow near Fátima, Portugal? Did these 3 children receive a powerful prophecy that still shakes the world today? What was the promise made to these 3 shepherd children over 80 years ago in an obscure village in Portugal that still haunts popes, priests, and nations? The Vatican now claims the infamous third secret of Fátima has finally been revealed. What is it they have kept hidden all these years?
Something very strange and very wonderful happened, not once, but many times, and as regular as clockwork, near the tiny village of Fátima in 1917, and it was witnessed by thousands of people. The result of that event was a far-reaching prophecy that still impacts the world today. The war against terrorism that began in Afghanistan has shed light on one of the most oppressive societies in history, especially where females are concerned. Stories of women being beaten or even stoned for the smallest of infractions have horrified the world. But would it surprise you to learn that in the days of Jesus, women were subject to a similar kind of treatment? The life of Mary Magdalene is probably our most notable example.
There are striking parallels between the oppression faced by women in many parts of the world today and the conditions that women faced in the time of Jesus. 2,000 years ago in Palestine, women were excluded from social and public life, so much so that they lived almost their entire life shut into their houses. They were deprived of an education and of any autonomy, and when they went out, which wasn't very often, most usually wore the traditional veil. In the area where Mary Magdalene lived, it was considered unsuitable for a man to speak to a woman in a public place.
In the male-dominated society of Jesus' day, only men were allowed to study the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. After Jesus' death in AD 30, the Hebrew Scriptures had become twisted around. After AD 70, a few Jewish leaders began to believe that God would not even speak to a woman. Of course, this isn't what the Bible says at all, but cultural influences overpowered the truth, and women were the ones who suffered.
It was in this extremely patriarchal society that Mary Magdalene lived, met Jesus, and became part of history. But how was this possible in a world where women were treated as objects of scorn? Something radical must have happened to Mary Magdalene to cause this transformation. But what?
The legend of Mary Magdalene is actually much different than the reality of who she was. The image most often associated with her is that of a prostitute, but the scripture references don't say that at all. In Luke chapter 8, we get our first introduction to Mary Magdalene. It's tied to the story of Jesus traveling from town to town and preaching. We're told that the 12 disciples were traveling with Jesus, along with several women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. One of these women, Mary Magdalene, had 7 demons come out of her, presumably by a miracle that Jesus had performed. But nowhere does it say that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute.
How is it possible that a woman with no historical hint of sexual immorality in her past has become associated with the world's oldest profession?
Some scholars believe that Mary Magdalene acquired the reputation of a prostitute simply because of proximity. In the Bible, right before the story of Mary Magdalene, we find a very compelling tale about an unnamed woman. The Bible tells us that this woman had led a sinful life. Yet when she heard that Jesus was at a nearby house, she went there to see him.
As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them.
The context of the story and the language that's used leads Bible scholars to believe that the woman's sin was sexual and that she was probably a prostitute. However, when Jesus saw her heartfelt repentance, he forgave her. But there's absolutely no evidence that the unnamed woman and Mary Magdalene are one and the same.
Mary Magdalene was a follower of Jesus. Now, some have said she's the one that's referred to as the prostitute in the Scriptures. We don't know that. The Scriptures don't say that. Dan Brown goes so far as to say the church was in this grand conspiracy to try to taint her reputation. Well, no, the church was in no such conspiracy. Now, there were some who made that error, who associated and assumed that Mary Magdalene was the prostitute. We don't have any biblical evidence for that. One of those was Gregory the Great in the year 590. He thought that Mary Magdalene was probably the once referred to as the prostitute. One of the reasons for that theory is because she comes from Magdala, which is associated with a great deal of prostitution and traffic. But biblically, there's no evidence at all that she in fact was a prostitute. She was a follower of Jesus Christ, and an important one.
Mary Magdalene was an honored disciple of Jesus who supported him in ministry and was the beneficiary of an exorcism that Jesus performed. There are 12 passages that mention Mary Magdalene in the New Testament, and there she is described as a supporter of Jesus, as one who saw the crucifixion, as one who saw him buried, and one to whom Jesus appeared. There is no indication whatsoever that she was a prostitute. She is simply an exemplary believer in Jesus Christ. The description of Mary Magdalene as an apostle comes from a church father, in which he is not using the term in the way we normally use it to refer to one of the 12 around Jesus, but using it in its most basic sense. someone who is sent to give a message to another. This is precisely what Mary Magdalene did after the resurrection. She received the vision of the risen Lord, saw him, held on to him, and then went and told others that Jesus had appeared to her. She was an apostle in the generic sense, not in the technical sense. Some people ask where the idea that Mary Magdalene was the prostitute came from. Well, it really comes from a series of confusions between passages. There is an unnamed woman who anoints Jesus in Luke 7, and Mary Magdalene appears in Luke 8 right after this passage. But what's important to note is that Mary Magdalene appears as a new character, not as the woman who just anointed Jesus. In addition to this, there are two anointings, one involving the woman specifically named as Mary, in the other Gospels that are noted during the last week of Jesus' life. Multiple accounts is what I mean. And so when you put the Mary of these accounts together with the Mary Magdalene of Luke 8 and then go back to Luke 7, someone deduced this must be Mary Magdalene, the prostitute, the sinful woman of Luke 7. In fact, Gregory the Great did it in 591. He's the first one to make this identification. And it carried on as a mistake for centuries afterwards. Even the Catholic Church recently has recognized that this is incorrect.
Mary Magdalene has really been beset by so many false charges. It was a pope in the 5th century who first described her as the woman caught in sin, but there's no evidence whatever that she practiced the world's oldest profession. She did have some psychological problems, which Jesus cured, after which she was one of his prime supporters, along with other women in Galilee. And maybe we better let it go at that. There are so many sensationalist writers today who are like so many doddering mothers trying to marry off an over-eligible son, and she's always the candidate for Mrs. Jesus. Not historical.
But if the sinful woman in Luke chapter 7 was not Mary Magdalene, then how did the real Mary acquire such a bad reputation? Is it simply because Mary was a woman that she was unfairly branded? Or is there something more to this story? Was Mary Magdalene a threat to the established order of society?
Mary Magdalene played a very important role in early Christianity, and we have information about her in several documents in the New Testament Gospels and in also apocryphal and Gnostic writings. Some of the Gnostic writings have scenes of rivalry between Peter and Mary Magdalene, which Peter says that women are not worthy of leadership. Peter seems to be irked by Mary Magdalene's leadership, but the use of Peter here probably represents some kind of criticism of the dominant church tradition.
Could it be that Peter and the other male disciples of Jesus resented Mary Magdalene's position in their group? There were other rivalries among the disciples early in Jesus' ministry, and at one time Jesus rebuked Peter by saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Was it Peter himself who was somehow responsible for damaging Mary's reputation? It's important to remember that these apocryphal stories come to us from texts that are not accepted by the Protestant Church. These books were excluded from the Bible because they weren't considered by the early Church Fathers to be divinely inspired. Most modern scholars question the historical accuracy of most apocryphal books. But what does the Bible have to say about the disciples' attitudes toward women?
One of the best indications that we have of how the disciples treated women can be seen in the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. In this story, Jesus speaks to a woman in a public place while the disciples are elsewhere. What's more, she was a Samaritan woman, someone that Jews traditionally would not associate with in their culture. The text tells us that when the disciples returned to the well, they were surprised to find Jesus speaking to a woman. That was just socially unacceptable. Yet the text goes on to tell us that none of the disciples questioned what Jesus was doing, because Jesus was their teacher, as well as their master, and he wanted to teach them an important lesson, that women should be treated with respect and as equals. The point of the story is that Jesus didn't reserve his teachings and miracles just for men. He shared them with everybody. And this is the philosophy he wanted to instill in his disciples.
The Bible tells us that Jesus treated women as equals. Yet it's precisely for this reason that many men ridiculed his teachings. Christianity was even branded as a religion for women and slaves. Is it possible that in the minds of some, perhaps even some of the disciples, Mary Magdalene's prominent place in Jesus' entourage threatened to undermine the foundation of the new Christian movement? Did her influence with Jesus go beyond just that of a supporter and follower? Does her influence touch us today in ways we never imagined? Could it be that Mary Magdalene was actually the source for the Gospel of John?
What we know about Mary Magdalene, we know from scriptures, mostly from the Gospel of Luke, in which she is introduced as one of a group of women that followed Jesus and his disciples in support of them, and then from all four Gospels, which place her as the first witness to the empty tomb. A very important role in Christian tradition, which led, for example, Eastern Christians to refer to her as the apostle to the apostles. That's all we know for sure about Mary Magdalene. Subsequent Christian traditions have placed her spreading the gospel to Provence in France or to other parts of the Middle East. We don't know any of that for sure, but we do know that throughout Christian history, she has been revered as a brave, courageous witness to the truth of the risen Christ.
The story of Mary Magdalene is a fascinating tale, not only for its positive message to women, but also for its mysterious twists and turns. What is the real story of this courageous woman? And how could someone who devoted her life to serving Jesus go from being a heroine of the church to being called a harlot?
Mary Magdalene certainly seems to be a woman of independent financial means and also independent spirit. We know this because the New Testament tells us that Mary Magdalene supported Jesus financially and also followed him in his ministry, and clearly he affirmed her as well. This was a significant departure from what was expected in the society of Jesus' time.
All of that is well and good, of course, but what effect, if any, would that have had on the other disciples, men who knew only the rules of the society in which they lived? We can look at the case of Mary Magdalene and see that a woman's commitment to Jesus and his ministry may have posed a serious threat to the male-dominated society of her day. But who was responsible for slandering Mary Magdalene's reputation? Is it a conspiracy that has been lost to time? Or does the evidence point to just one man?
In the early centuries of the church, there was, of course, no printed Bibles because there was no printing. Wealthy people, churches, scholars would have had handwritten codices. But ordinary people would have depended on the oral reading of Scripture, and particularly on sermons. In 591, toward the end of the 6th century, Pope Gregory I gave such a sermon on the person of Mary Magdalene. Now, Pope Gregory was responsible for a major confusion in the tradition about Mary Magdalene, because he fused together three different stories. The story about the woman who anointed Jesus, described as a sinner, the story about Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and then the figure of Mary Magdalene. And he put them together in a composite figure and imagined that they were one person who was a former prostitute.
In his sermon, Pope Gregory interpreted an aspect of Mary Magdalene's story in a new way. He said that the 7 demons that were cast out of Mary signified all the vices, that is, the 7 deadly sins, and one of the most heinous of these sins was lust.
Because of Pope Gregory, Mary Magdalene became the 7 deadly sins personified. And if that didn't damage her reputation enough, he also drew an unflattering connection between her and the unnamed sinful woman in Luke's Gospel. The sinful woman in the Bible not only wept at Jesus' feet, she also poured costly perfume on them. Pope Gregory embellished this story by proclaiming that the sinful woman had used that same fragrance to prepare her body for forbidden acts. By drawing this conclusion, the Pope made it clear that the unnamed woman was a prostitute, and that meant that Mary Magdalene would be labeled as such for more than 1,400 years.
Looking back through history, it would seem that Pope Gregory recklessly, even needlessly, slandered Mary Magdalene's reputation. What could have been his reason for doing such a thing?
The Pope's modified story of Mary Magdalene would become a powerful symbol for people throughout the world, that even the worst sinner could be forgiven. Many people do not believe that Pope Gregory's motive was to discredit Mary, but to use her to draw people to the church, and as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. For nearly 2,000 years, she's inspired millions of people, especially women. And in the Catholic Church, she even has her own feast day. But there's no denying the negative effect that the Pope's decree had. By branding Mary Magdalene a prostitute, he not only robbed her of her good name, but he robbed millions of women of a strong female role model. The Mary that we find in the Gospels was very important to Jesus, and was probably a leader among his group of followers, especially after his crucifixion and resurrection.
Was the story of Mary Magdalene changed simply because a 6th century pope wanted Christianity to appeal to a wider audience? Or was the truth distorted long before that? And if so, why? Was it because some in the church thought the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus was more romantic than it was comfortable with? Is there a part of Mary's true story that has yet to be revealed?
The whole notion that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and that they had a child actually arose in France in about the 9th century. And the Gnostic Gospels refer to Jesus and his relationship to Mary as if she was special to him, and in some sense she was. But nothing is said about marriage and nothing is said about children. And furthermore, those Gnostic Gospels that receive so much attention in the Da Vinci Code, they are really quite unreliable as sources of information. For example, the Gospel of Philip is said to have been written in about 250 AD in Syria. Now you think about it. Whose description of George Washington would you believe? Someone who actually knew George Washington? Or someone who lived, say, 200 years after George Washington and wrote about him, particularly if the person who did that wanted to put his own political ideas into George Washington's mouth? That's exactly what the Gnostics did. They attributed their own theories to the apostles. And the early church knew about these Gnostics and wrote against them because they understood that Gnosticism was heresy.
Actually, at that time, the fact that any women were included in the group is significant. It was very much a patriarchal society, and so men had the say in most issues. The fact that Jesus embraces everyone, male and female, sick as well, is a new concept for that generation of people. And that actually continues through all generations, I think. The fact that he embraces all sort of people. And so Mary and Mary Magdalene being part of that inner core was truly significant for the inclusion of women, especially in Christianity.
The scriptures don't provide a lot of facts about Mary Magdalene, but one thing seems certain. She was an important member of the very close group that accompanied Jesus. But new discoveries about the authorship of the Gospel of John are now giving scholars something different to think about, and just may be offering an important clue as to who Mary Magdalene really was.
The description of the love of Jesus for Mary Magdalene has given rise to modern misunderstandings. Modern people like to imagine some kind of romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
There are several apocryphal texts that were written after the New Testament Gospels that are not included in the Christian Bible. Those texts, such as the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, illustrate the significance that Mary Magdalene held in the life of Jesus. But it's the Gospel of Philip that implies that there may have been a relationship that is more intimate than most people realize. In this text, Mary Magdalene is described as the companion of Jesus. But the most significant piece of information that the text gives us is that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene. So much so that she is often referred to as the Blessed One.
What significance, if any, should we place on these apocryphal references to Mary Magdalene? After all, they were written much later than the New Testament Gospels. Does that mean they're necessarily wrong about the relationship between Mary and Jesus?
The so-called romantic references in the Gospel of Philip, considered in the light of the cultures that produced them, refer to a spiritual, not a sexual intimacy. And so calling Mary Magdalene the Blessed One is not surprising. It was a common early Christian term for dozens of saints.
In the 21st century, it's easy for people to misunderstand what was meant by the idea of love in these ancient texts. They imagine some kind of modern romance rather than the understanding of the love relationship between a master and a beloved disciple. But modern scholars generally do not accept the idea that there was some kind of romantic or perhaps even marriage relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The relationship of Mary Magdalene and Jesus is clearly understood in the ancient texts as a relationship of discipleship. Mary was a very special disciple, a disciple that is described as understanding Jesus in a very deep way.
The evidence for Jesus not being married is extensive. I have in my library a collection of 39 volumes of early church material, both Orthodox and unorthodox. This is small print, single-spaced, double-columned material. In none of this material is there any indication that Jesus was ever married. If Jesus had been married, there probably would not have been a conspiracy to not make that clear. They would have been very proud of the fact. In fact, it was very Jewish to be married and to raise children. So there is no reason for the church to have a cover-up at all. And had Jesus been married, there would have been no effort to cover it up. The evidence that we have that Jesus didn't have children is basically the same evidence that we have that he wasn't married, plus one other feature. It's probably likely that the tradition that arose in the Roman Catholic Church that priests be celibate and single has its roots in the ministry and life of Jesus himself. Some people argue that if Jesus had children, his offspring would have been divine as well, and this would explain why he could not have had children, even hypothetically. But I think this is wrong. Mary is responsible in part for the birth of Jesus as a woman who is a sinner, and that doesn't prevent Jesus from being divine if God wants him to be divine when he's born. So the mixture of the human and the divine doesn't determine necessarily the nature of the outcome.
Mary Magdala and the other women are described as staying faithfully by Jesus' side as he hung on the cross, and the male disciples are described as having fled. When he died, she wept bitterly, and then on the third day after his death, she and other women are described as bringing spices to embalm his body. And it was then that she experienced the risen Christ for the first time. Jesus tells Mary to go and tell the other disciples that he has risen. So she becomes the first one to announce the resurrection. It's very significant that Mary Magdalene was entrusted with this task of announcing the resurrection to the other disciples, because in those days women were not regarded as having the authority to be official witnesses.
According to biblical scholars and historians, Jesus did not have a romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene. But is there another clue to Mary's identity that might be hidden in these non-scriptural texts? The apocryphal Gospel of Philip tells us that Mary Magdalene was often referred to as the Blessed One and the one that Jesus loved most. Could this seemingly simple statement hold the key to a mystery that, if revealed, would demand a rewrite of Bible history?
After studying both the scriptural and the non-scriptural references to Mary Magdalene, I found that there is strong evidence which points to her as the primary author of the Gospel of John. She may not have been the one to put pen to paper, but I believe that her recollections of Jesus' life and Jesus' sayings formed the basis for the book.
Could it be that this possibility was exactly what some leaders of the primitive church wanted to avoid? And how does one go about erasing a person from history?
There are several cryptic references in the Gospel of John which refer to an unnamed disciple, one who's repeatedly referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. In John chapter 21, we're told that this is the same disciple who wrote down the events that are included in the Gospel of John. But for some reason, the writer apparently wanted to keep the identity of the beloved disciple a secret. And that's strange, because this disciple was obviously an extremely important figure in the history of their community.
For thousands of years, Bible scholars and Christians alike have wondered who this mysterious disciple might be, and many have surmised that whoever it was, he was probably responsible for writing the Gospel of John. But notice how even today, the reference is always to he. Is it possible that the author wasn't a man at all?
Today, most biblical scholars believe that St. John, the son of Zebedee, did not write the gospel that bears his name. Instead, they give credit to the anonymous beloved disciple. And what's interesting is that several non-biblical texts identify this disciple as none other than Mary Magdalene.
Could it be that the disciple whom Jesus loved was actually Mary Magdalene? Was the gender of the unnamed disciple in the Gospel of John changed in order to conceal Mary Magdalene's identity? And if so, why?
There is no known instance of an ancient Jewish, Greek, or Roman literary source, nor any biblical literature in which a woman wrote as if she were a man. In the original texts of the Greek New Testament, the beloved disciple is referred to with masculine pronouns. And while there is only a small body of literature from women in the ancient world, when they did write, they wrote in their own names and were accepted in that role. Mary Magdalene was a real-life participant in the life and ministry of Jesus and an eyewitness to his crucifixion and resurrection, but she is not the anonymous author of the Gospel of John.
The possibility that Mary Magdalene was a source or even the author of the Gospel of John is just one man's opinion, and it will undoubtedly continue to be challenged. The authorship for this Gospel has never been determined beyond a reasonable doubt, and Mary Magdalene was certainly in a position to have had first-hand knowledge of Jesus' life and teachings. And regardless of who wrote the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene was a woman of independent means and spirit, and was a central figure in what can arguably be called the greatest drama of human history. Particularly in light of current world events, her story seems to carry a message for all people. What matters most in life is the capacity to love. It was an event witnessed by thousands of people, yet the results of that event were kept hidden by the Vatican for over 80 years. Then, in June of 2000, Pope John Paul II suddenly, and without warning, released what had been the Vatican's most closely guarded secret. Could it be that these few lines, scribbled on a piece of paper almost a century ago, have changed all of our lives irrevocably? Since 1981, in bloody and war-torn Bosnia, a group of children, now grown to young men and women, claim to have seen an apparition of the Virgin Mary near a cement cross on a rocky hillside, and thousands of pilgrims ignore the bloodshed and strife to make their way to what was once Yugoslavia in order to see this amazing phenomenon for themselves. But you are more likely to have heard about a similar apparition in Fátima, Portugal in 1917 than about the appearance in Medjugorje. Why? What is there about the Fátima experience that is so unique? These three children, Jacinto, age 8, and her brother Francisco, age 9, and a cousin, Lucia, the eldest of the three at age 10, all claimed to see what they called the Blessed Mother standing above a small oak tree in a field where they tended sheep. If that's all there was to it, the entire thing would most likely have been forgotten long ago. But there was more, much more. Because she was the oldest, Lucia was expected to look after her two younger cousins, and she took her responsibilities very seriously. That's why on May 13th, 1917, a bright, sunny Sabbath day, when she saw a brilliant flash of light in the sky, Lucia instructed them to immediately start the sheep for home. It could be the warning of an impending storm. But that flash of light was about to bring something into their lives far more exciting than a mere thunderstorm. Another flash of light drew their attention to the top of a small oak tree that stood near the gate of the pasture. There, above the tree, her feet not quite touching the branches, stood the image of a beautiful young woman, all dressed in white. A white mantle covered her head, and a brilliant aura surrounded her and enveloped the children as well. Her white dress was tied at the neck with a golden ribbon. A white hooded cloak bordered with gold covered her head and framed her whole body. A necklace of gold hung nearly to her waist, and her hands were folded in front of her, as if in prayer. How do we know all this? Lucia told her mother, "We were so close that we were inside the circle of light that radiated from her." But even that kind of clarity wouldn't have been enough to create the worldwide fame and rapt devotion this apparition has achieved. What was so singularly different about this vision?
In fact, there were an amazing number of witnesses to this event over the 6 months period of time that it happened, literally tens of thousands of people. But the most interesting thing of all that to me is that there were prophecies and promises that were made by the lady to the children that have come true with some astonishing accuracy. In fact, these prophecies are having a very profound effect on our world today.
The appearance of the apparition at Fátima was apparently not a one-day event, nor was it limited to just the children. It was, however, selective on other levels. Only the children could hear the apparition, and of the children, only Lucia could speak with her. But we're getting ahead of our story. The apparition first assured the children they did not have to be afraid, and told them she was from heaven. She then gave them some astonishing instructions. They were to return to the same place on the 13th day of the month, every month, for the next 6 months. Then, she said, she would tell them who she was and what she wanted. She also asked the children if they were prepared to offer themselves to God and to accept all the suffering He would send to them to make up for the sins of the world. Lucia responded for all the children with a forceful yes. The children would soon have an opportunity to remember that decision with all its frightful implications, but the record shows no hint that any of them ever regretted or reneged on their promise to the lady.
Lucia was a profoundly religious child, and she had no way of knowing what was going on around her because she was just trying to be a kid and live. And that what was going on in 1917 that she was in the midst of would turn out to be one of history's most profound eras.
The political climate in Portugal in 1917 was extremely hostile. It was against the Catholic Church because the people who took over power were Masons, were humanists who did not like the dominance of the Church in the Portuguese society. So they tried to suppress what happens in Fátima because, of course, they realized that it has the potential and power to re-strengthen the Catholic Church.
The children decided it would be best if they didn't tell anyone about their experience. But by the time they reached home, their vow of silence had been completely forgotten. Jacinta immediately told her mother everything that had happened, with Francisco eagerly agreeing. Children are not often listened to, even today. And given the historical context of the time, the reaction is perhaps quite understandable. Lucia's mother tried every way she could think of to make her confess that she had made up the story. Lucia, in tears, begged her mother to stop the accusations. Instead, she dragged her off to the village priest. They threatened to shut her up for the rest of her life if she didn't confess she'd been telling lies. But all their efforts were in vain. Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco had made a promise to the lady and to God, and not even threats from parents, the church, or eventually even the government would deter them. The story spread through the whole region, and on June 13th, over 50 people had gathered near the oak tree starting early in the morning. The children arrived about 11 o'clock. Their parents refused to come with them, afraid of being embarrassed if the whole thing turned out to be a fraud. But neither the children nor the visitors would be disappointed. Precisely at noon, the lady was there. Again, according to witnesses, it was Lucia who did all the talking. Frustrated and unhappy, Lucia asked if she would please take them with her to heaven. The answer was the first of several prophetic and therefore verifiable statements. The apparition told Lucia she would take Jacinta and Francisco to heaven soon, but Lucia would be required to stay a while longer. Lucia was devastated, but she accepted the lady's answer without question. Again, there was a dull explosion. Witnesses reported seeing only a little cloud above the tree rise up slowly and move off toward the east. The vision had survived its first test, and news of the mysterious phenomenon spread like wildfire.
By July 13th, hundreds of villagers and travelers were coming to see the miracle in the meadow. But the chief administrator of the province, Arthur Santos, saw this as a direct challenge to the goals of the political regime. So the last thing that he needed was some miracle.
The July 13th appearance was particularly notable. On this visit, the lady showed all three children a terrible vision. Lucia was told to write what she had seen in a letter. She was free to talk about the first two parts of the vision, but the last part was to be kept secret until 1960, 43 years into the future. The first of the three prophecies was that World War I would end soon, but another and more terrible war would begin in the reign of the next pope. The second dealt specifically with Russia, saying that nation would spread terrors throughout the world, but if Russia were to be consecrated to the worship of the Mother of God, then Russia would eventually cease to be a threat to other nations. But what of the third prophecy?
On the 10th of August, the summons was delivered to the parents of the three children. They had to appear the next morning at 11 o'clock at the town hall in Urem. The rumor about the secret given to the children has reached Santos, and he tried everything to find out what it was about. But none of the children, and especially not Lucia, was willing to reveal it to him. On the 13th of August, Fátima was flooded by over 15,000 visitors, and Lucia had a hard time to fight her way through the masses, and when she eventually reached the home of her cousins, she found Santos being with them already and interrogating them.
The administrator had kidnapped the children on the day that the lady was scheduled to appear. And word of this spread throughout the town, and the mood was pretty ugly. In fact, the townspeople were prepared to storm the jail where the administrator was keeping the children. But at about noontime, when the sighting was scheduled to happen, a sudden clap of thunder brought everything to a halt. Thousands of people looked around to see what had made that sound and noticed a white cloud that moved over and came to rest right above the oak tree, and after it was there just for a couple of moments, rose up, flew away, disappeared. Meanwhile, back at the jail, Santos is trying to get the children to recant their story. He's using bribes, he's using threats, nothing has worked. So, amazingly, he threatens to boil them in oil.
For 2 more days, Santos threatened the children without success. They stood by every tiny nuance of their story, including their promise not to tell anyone about the third prophecy. Finally, on the 15th, he released them. Nothing, not even the threat of being boiled in oil, could shake their faith in the vision of the lady. But what did it all mean? Surely a 10-year-old child in Fátima, Portugal, could not know of the terrible and bloody coup Lenin had in mind for the Tsar of Russia, or the horrible massacres that would come in his wake. And not even the most practiced politicians would have predicted a quick end to World War I, let alone another, even bloodier war. Was there a condition in the prophecy that would end Russian terror? If so, has that condition been met? And what was the secret of the third prophecy? Lucia obediently wrote it down, but it would not be revealed in 1960. It would not be revealed until the year 2000. What did it say? The third part of the Fátima prophecy was carefully written down by the young Lucia and delivered to the Pope in a sealed envelope. Some reports say it was read before the College of Cardinals. Others claim only the popes have seen it. One report, never denied, said that when Pope Pius XII read the letter, he fainted. What message could a child of 10 have written that would have such a profound impact on a pope? Was it a warning of the last great war, or a timetable counting down to the end of the world? World War I did, of course, end very soon, and World War II arrived right on schedule, just as predicted. The first part of the prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. But the vision about Russia is a bit more problematic. Could it be that the war against communism was not won on the stage of world politics, but rather in a remote village in the mountains of Portugal?
By the evening of September 12th, there were endless streams of people had made their way to Fátima. 30,000 people, most of them deep in prayer. All the troubles of the world had been brought to this one place by these people, hoping that Our Lady would grant their request to heal the sick and to return their husband from war, and that all would be made right for them.
On October 13th, the day the great miracle was to be performed, it was almost impossible to find space enough to kneel and pray anywhere near the pasture. To make matters worse, the cold autumn winds had begun to blow, and a continuous drizzle of rain had begun the night before that soaked through coats, hats, and shoes. The children had great difficulty getting through to the small oak tree, but at last everything was as it should be. Lucia called out to the crowd that the lady was coming, and the huge crowd fell silent. Once again, the apparition spoke only to Lucia, telling her she wanted a chapel built on that very spot. What happened next is still a cause of great controversy. According to witnesses, and there were thousands of them, a slender column of bluish smoke appeared about 6 feet above the heads of the children and rose to a height of about 6 feet above that. Suddenly, the sun, which had been hiding behind the clouds, broke through and shone brightly. Witnesses claimed they could look directly at the sun, clearly defined and radiant, without it hurting their eyes. But the sun didn't remain in place. Instead, it started rotating at a mad speed as if detached from the sky and came rushing toward Earth. Everything took on the color of amethyst. Some witnesses reported the event as the sun becoming as a white ball and falling toward Earth in a zigzag manner, while all around them buildings and people changed from red to blue to yellow hues of color. And there was one other still unexplained phenomenon. The people suddenly became aware that their clothes, which had been dripping wet just moments before, were now perfectly dry.
The lady had fulfilled her promise to the 3 children. A miracle had been performed for everyone to see. Jacinta and Francisco died of tuberculosis while children, just as the lady had said, which left only Lucia to bear the burden of the apparition prophecies.
Then there was the matter of the Pope consecrating Russia to the worship of the Mother of God in order to end the terror and bloodshed that nation would bring to the earth. But over the years, no amount of pleading by a simple peasant girl, now a Carmelite nun, could persuade any of the popes to go quite that far. Then there was that enigmatic third prophecy, When it was not revealed in 1960, as Lucia had been instructed, some people became fixated on knowing what was in it, but the popes were immovable. Then on May 13, 1981, the 64th anniversary of the beginning of the Fátima visions, Pope John Paul II was shot by a Turkish national named Mehmet Ali Agca because he said the Pope refused to release the third prophecy of Fátima. Just 11 days earlier, an ex-Trappist monk had hijacked an Irish jetliner demanding the Vatican publish the third portion of the Fátima message. There was no response from the Vatican in either case. But the world had not heard the last of John Paul II or Lucia. On December 8, 1983, the Pope sent a letter composed with the help of Lucia to all bishops everywhere, inviting them to join him in consecrating the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary on March 25, 1984. In part of the prayer he said, "Most especially we entrust and consecrate to you those individuals and nations which need this help most, particularly Russia." Sister Lucia seemed finally to be satisfied. In fact, within 1 year after the consecration ceremony, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Secretary General of the Russian Communist Party, and soon communist regimes began tumbling like building blocks. Finally, even the Berlin Wall came down. There was just one more aspect of the Fatima experience to be resolved: the secret of the third prophecy.
In June of the year 2000, the Vatican finally, after 83 years, on direct order of the Pope, published what before was its best kept secret, the third part of the secret of Fatima. The key parts of the secret read as follows.
I write in obedience to you, my God, who command me to do so through His Excellency, the Bishop of Lyria, and through your most holy mother and mine. After the two parts, which I've already explained, at the left of Our Lady and a little above, we saw an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand flashing. It gave out flames that looked as though they would set the world on fire, but they died out in contact with the splendor that Our Lady radiated towards him from her right hand. Pointing to the earth with his right hand, the angel cried out in a loud voice, "Penance! Penance! Penance!" And we saw in an immense light that is God, something similar to how people appear in a mirror when they pass in front of it, a bishop dressed in white. We had the impression that it was the Holy Father. Other bishops, priests, men and women going up a steep mountain at the top of which there was a big cross of rough-hewn trunk, as of a cork tree with the bark. Having reached the top of the mountain, on his knees at the foot of the big cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him, and in the same way there died, one after another, the other bishops and priests.
The secret, which was so carefully guarded over so many years, was apparently a prophecy about the failed assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981.
A 20-year-old assassination attempt was the secret the Vatican had kept hidden for over 80 years. But at least the wondering was over, and the world could rest. Or could it? Even before the official publication of the prophecy, questions about its authenticity were being raised around the world. An article in the New York Times highlighted the disappointment of many who had waited decades for the disclosure. As is so often the case, when the Vatican lifts a veil to appease public opinion, it raises more questions. In this case, the questions ranged from misinterpretation to outright forgery.
When the third secret was revealed, we questioned the authenticity of it because of the information contained in what we knew. We hired Spokane forensic labs to examine it and compare Sister Lucy's writings and other letters. It did not compare with what was in the third secret released on June 26, 2000.
There are still those who believe the third message of Fatima was apocalyptic in nature and predicted chaos in the Church. Obviously, the purported secret that was revealed in June of 2000 doesn't live up to that expectation. For now, what many hoped would be a closed matter remains a mystery.